Hi, and welcome to the Writing to Market versus Market Awareness workshop. My name is Becca Syme, and I am an author success alignment coach. And my goal in this workshop is to talk to you about the answer to the question, why are my books not selling? Because that is typically when we hear the right to market advice brought up. And so I want to cover some big picture things about writing to market today. But in order to do that, I need to start off. I'm going to have to share my screen here. But I need to start off with an understanding of how we give advice in this industry and why it's important to deconstruct this. So let's start off with the typical question that I would start with, which is how many of you know someone with brown hair who is also named Daniel? And I have a set of pictures here in case you are not familiar with how many Daniels there are in the world who have dark hair. But there are a lot. There are a lot. And the percentage is extremely high with the name of Daniel and the crossover. And so then what I always follow up with is, do you know anyone named Daniel who doesn't have brown hair? Because it is more unusual. And typically, if we were all in a room together and you were raising your hands, we would see most of the hands would go up when we ask about brown haired Daniels. And then if you know someone named Daniel who doesn't have brown hair or dark hair, the hands would be much fewer. And in some rooms, it's 5%, right? Like it's very small. So then my question, of course, for the room is, what percentage of people in the world do you think, would you say, are named Daniel who have brown hair? And then let's just say that it was 90%. It's not, and don't go look it up because it's not an important piece of information, but let's just say it was 90%. Would that impact what you named your baby if you were having a baby with brown hair? And of course, everyone in the room says, what kind of stupid question is this, Becca? No, of course, I am not going to be impacted by the percentage of people named Daniel who have brown hair. Of course, I'm not going to be impacted by the percentage in the world. And then I say, why? Why? Would it make you assume that everyone with brown hair is named Daniel, or that everyone named Daniel has to have brown hair, depending on which direction you go with this? And you would say no. And then I would say, why not? Because I want to understand, and more so, I want you to understand why you have the immediate gut response of this is such a stupid question to ask. But it's not a stupid question to ask when it comes to things like, should I write to market or not? Because what essentially happens when we ask someone a question that we don't have a lot of experience understanding is that we assume if they are certain about it, they are also correct. So, whatever answer they give me, as long as it sounds logical to me, it seems correct, quote unquote, it seems logical, then I am likely to believe it if, and this is the important if you do not have a lot of experience with it. So we apply predictive reasoning to things where it does not apply, specifically because we do not have enough experience. So the reason why you don't, when I ask the question about like, is this going to impact what you name your brown haired baby? And everybody says, of course not. That's the dumbest question I've ever heard, and immediately want to stop listening. But I say, but wait a second, because how many babies have you seen named? This is why you have seen hundreds, maybe thousands of babies named in your lifetime. So you instinctively understand statistics have no place in that type of decision because it isn't an important contextual piece of data for me to have in order to be able to make that decision. We instinctively know that that's true about babies because of the volume of information that we have, the number of babies. If we do not have that much experience, we will take any answer that makes us feel secure. And this is the danger zone in every single problem that we have in our entire lifetime, by the way. This does not just apply to book sales, this applies to everything in the author industry. We are way too quick to give up our agency when it comes to decision making because somebody who sounds real certain has an opinion that we don't know anything about. So if someone says to me, why are my books not selling? I am so cautious about having any opinion immediately because there is so much that could be at play in why books don't sell, including that we're operating in a saturated market. So if you're not getting discoverability, that might be the only reason that your books aren't selling. But yet we want it to be something that we have control over, something that we can do something about, because we just want this icky feeling to go away. And this is what frustrates me about when humans don't understand this about ourselves. We hate feeling uncertain. We hate not understanding something. It makes us feel insecure. And we don't understand that that's what's happening. When I say, why aren't my books selling? I think what I'm doing is asking a logical question. But what I'm really doing is asking an emotional question. And I don't understand that because when an author says, what's wrong? Why aren't my books selling? They may not be conscious that underneath that they're feeling feelings. And what they're really saying to me is, help me understand these feelings, Becca, but they think they're being logical. So the reason this is so important to understand is that when someone speaks with certainty in this industry about something we do not know anything about, we are the most likely to believe whatever they say that makes us feel relieved about it. Whatever they say that seems logically correct, that seems like it has a good answer, it's almost, well, it's not almost, it is biological. We are feeling insecure. We want to feel secure. Somebody's speaking with a lot of certainty, and so we believe them. The danger zone there is that when they are not correct about it, like if someone is giving you an answer they're very certain about, that the only reason they're certain is because it worked for them, because it was and again, worked for them is still air quotes, because something can have worked. Like I can have sold books and also have written to market, and the writing to market can have nothing whatsoever to do with the reason why I sold books. But we're so quick to attribute things to places that are very consciously under our control. And we don't have enough understanding usually about what actually makes books sell, which is the reason that I do workshops like this. Because from a perspective of volume, I've coached so many thousands of authors, individual authors, by the way, not like groups like this of a giant number of people, but one-on-one individual authors, thousands and thousands of authors. And the reason this is so important is that what I see as attributable reasons to why books are not selling so rarely has anything to do with the intention behind how I wrote the book to market. And when it does, even if the overlap is there, right? Even if I did intentionally write to market and then I also sold, that doesn't always mean that's why the books are selling. And again, I'm not trying to argue against writing to market, and I should have started here. Because I get so this certainty versus correctness thing is so hard for people to understand. They don't realize that when they feel uncertain about something, if it's an XY axis, that they think that certainty and correctness are on the same axis, that as certainty goes up, correctness goes up, but they're inverse, proportionate to each other, so that you can be completely and totally certain and absolutely incorrect, and you can be totally and completely uncertain and 100% correct. And you can't gauge anything by whether or not someone is certain, because you don't know where their certainty is coming from. They may be a sociopath. They may be only taking their own consideration into account, their own experience into account. They may be lying to you, right? Like there's all reasons why people are giving you advice. And again, I don't say this to say never listen to anyone, never trust anyone's advice. It's to say, I'm going to go through the difference between market awareness and writing to market in this workshop. And what you are the most likely to discover, and I'll just spoiler alert it so that if you would prefer not to listen to the next 40 minutes, you don't have to. But spoiler alert, your intuition knows what's the best for you and you're ignoring it because your experience has told you what's true about how you write and how you create stories. And you're not listening to it because you're listening to what everyone else tells you you should do, quote unquote. And my goal in trying to increase people's ability to listen to their intuition is to say there's such a high likelihood that your intuition is correct because your subconscious brain knows more about your capacity than anybody outside you knows. And there's a higher likelihood that your intuition about what you should be doing, how you should be writing books, is so much more worth trusting or worth listening to. So, anyway, I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent here. So, let me keep going. But the most certainty that you hear in the industry around why are my books not selling is that did you write to market or not, right? How quote unquote to market are the books? And what frustrates me about this is there's sort of this vague understanding of what it means to write to market. So my goal today is to illustrate these two different styles of writing with the market in mind or inside of the market, in order to sell books, in order to get readers to read them. And I want to talk about both of them. But when we ask the question and we get the answer, did I write them to market? And we feel uncertain, then our immediate response is, well, I have to do it this way. So my goal in illustrating both sides is to say, okay, if you have all of these skills that are the writing to market takes advantage of all these skills and requires all of these to be at a pretty excellent level in order to do it with effectiveness, or we can practice the market awareness skill set. And really, this workshop is about those two different skill sets. So, when you are listening, I want you to be taking some notes about what your particular intuition is for you, how much you feel like you want to do one versus the other. And then I also want you to be listening for what is it that I can do to get better at these particular skills, because skills are always developable. So again, I go back to it must be that I didn't write to market enough, but is it? Right? Because remember the brown haired Daniel babies. We can't go making brown haired Daniel babies where there aren't any. So why would you not name your brown-haired baby Daniel? Because you've seen all of those babies and you know it. But in order for you to have that level of certainty that quote unquote writing to market is not responsible for you not selling, you would have to have produced that same hundreds of books, that level, because you would need to prove to yourself over time that that wasn't the reason. And frankly, we don't have that kind of time. So I'm hoping that by illustrating these two kind of sides of this discussion, that it will help you get to more clarity about this. So in order to begin this discussion, we have to talk first about what the market is and what the market is not. So I find it, because the market is so hard to define, to be the easiest to begin with what it isn't. So the market, first of all, is not a bookstore. It's not a physical location. It's not shelves. It's not Amazon. It's not, etc. The market is an unconscious, undefinable, descriptive word that is essentially whatever a whole bunch of individual readers' tastes have in common and what their buying demand is, right? So the market is essentially the overlap between all of these books that have been produced and all of the books that are being read, the overlap between that Venn diagram, which again, the books that are being read is 100%, of the market. But the books that exist for sale, when I'm saying the market, I'm talking about what is selling, what people are consuming. The availability of product would be a larger circle than that, right? So all the books that are currently not being read, which something like half the books on the Kindle store haven't even been purchased. So of the however many books there are now, 12 million or whatever books, right? There are millions of books that haven't even been purchased in the Kindle store, let alone read, because they're just well, but there are a lot of guesses as to what the reasons are behind that. But I'm not talking about that, the books that are produced and not read. I'm talking about the market as it exists in the expectations that are the overlap of all of those individual readers. So when a reader wants something and they think, I want a reverse harem menage, well, I guess those might be the same thing. The reverse harem alien vampire in space, whatever, right? Like that's what I want right now. Then that desire for that book goes into the ether, and either they find it and purchase it and read it or they don't. But because the reader has the desire for that, there is a market there for that book. If the book itself doesn't exist yet, then there's an unmet demand in the market for that book. But the market itself is the collection of the overlap of all of the readers' expectations about what they want. So the market doesn't exist anywhere, it's not a defined place. Even on some level, reading Amazon the way that we do, you're only really reading the Amazon market. And there are so many other markets out there for content. But even if we just say the Amazon market, still the bestseller lists and the rankings are still not the market. The market is still unconscious and undefined. And why is this so important? Because there is a demand for stuff that has not yet been produced, and there is a higher demand for things, for certain things, than there is um, supply. So when you first had Legends and Lattes that came out, right? There was a demand for books like that. And there weren't enough out there that had been produced yet. Now the supply has increased. So the demand has also now been more sated than it was. I don't know that it's fully sated or not, but there are still expectations that have not yet been met around cozy fantasy. And that market, that desire for the book to exist or the desire to consume that book is essentially what the market is. The reason that I define that so precisely in that way, in terms of like, it is not just Amazon, it's not a bookshelf, it's not a bestseller list, it's not even the books that exist, it's not even the books that are read, is because the market itself is the desire for the book to exist. And we don't know 100% for sure what that desire is, how to find it, how to understand it, etc. Like that desire itself is undefinable, it is unconscious, it's always moving, and it's only descriptive. It is never predictive. And the reason this is so important is that those of us who are going to edge towards the right to market, what we're essentially doing is we are writing books for a market that already is defined somewhere and exists physically somewhere, like it's locatable, right? Either by algorithms, if it's Amazon or social media or something like that, or by booksellers or by word of mouth or something like that, right? So when we have I want books like Legends and Lattes, and that book already exists, then the demand is more physical, it's more manifested, right? But there still is a lot of unmanifested market potential out there just because the readers' imaginations have not yet been sated. If they had, they would stop reading. So there's always going to be more of a market out there for something, more saleability out there for something than is currently being sated, until it is so saturated that it's no longer like no one wants to read it or listen to it or hear it anymore, see it anymore. And even in saturated markets, there still is so much room, because until there is no demand for it anymore, like until for whatever reason the demand shifts away, there's always going to be people who want more of something. And then your goal in discoverability is to figure out how to find those people. And that's a whole separate topic, right? But essentially, I had to cover this particular description. And this is why we've now gotten to the metaphor that we've gotten to, or the two different metaphors to talk about the market, because it is so important to understand there are boundaries around the market somewhere, but you are not going to be able to see them unless you're very specific types of people, which we'll talk about in a second. And you probably shouldn't be able to see them. You probably don't need to know that much about the edges of the market in order for you to write the books you're going to write. If you're going to sell your marketing services to other authors, if you're going to give advice to other authors, then we shift the perspective a little bit. Maybe I need to know a little more about the broader kind of physical space of the market around me. But many of us will be able to practice market awareness and not need to practice intentionally writing to market, specifically because of what the market is. Because the more it is an unconscious thing, which unconscious things always have manifestations, right? So, like when someone is angry, that's an unconscious feeling. We see the evidence of the anger in their clenched fists or in their breathing patterns or in the tension in their bodies or something like that. But we don't actually see the anger, the emotion anger. We see the effects of anger. The market is similar. We don't actually see the market, we see the effects of the met demands and unmet demands. But the market itself is more like ethereal, like that, like an emotion. And again, this is part of why I think the distinction between these two is so important. So, what we want the market to be is we essentially want it to be a target. Our preference is for something that is very visible, is very definable, and has a center that I can aim for, right? And for certain people, which we're going to talk about these skills in a second, but for certain people, writing as though the market is a target works for them because they have these skills that we're going to talk about. But the fewer of those skills and the less excellent I am at those skills, the more likely I need to be thinking about the market instead as a neighborhood rather than as a target. Because when the market is a target, I'm always looking for the evidence. Again, right? You cannot see the market, so you have to look for the evidence of it. So if I am always constantly looking for the evidence of the market, then I have this constant vigilance about it, right? Like I'm always trying to figure out, am I doing it right? What's going on? What are the boundaries? What's the center, right? I have all these questions that I'm trying to figure out. And the more difficult that process is for me, the less, well, not just easy, not just fun, but secure. The less secure it's going to be, the less likely it is to help me produce better books. Which, again, my goal with writers is to always help us make the decisions that are going to produce the best books that we can produce. Because what I can't tell you, so let's go back to this idea of the target. Let's say that Legends and Lattes manifested a whole new section of the market. I do think there were other things out there that were kind of portenting about this, especially because there were several books that were sort of released at one time that all kind of had this vibe to it. But let's just say with cozy fantasy that we manifested a whole new segment of the market when we started with cozy fantasy. Let's just say that was true. So now there's a definable set of characteristics around this book in particular, or the books that are similar to it, that all have something in common. And then that thing they have in common, or the set of precepts or concepts or architecture, or whatever that they have in common, is now the target that we're all shooting for. So let's just say that you could, in theory, build a book that had all of those things that are now contained inside of that target set of expectations. And the book is finished, and now we're going to launch it. So if I launch this book that has all of these expectations that supposedly hits the center of this target, and that book is an arrow, and I now shoot the arrow at the target by launching, right? And as soon as I shoot the arrow, then my expectation is that that arrow is going to hit the center of the target and that I'm going to win the lottery essentially, right? Because, like, oh, I wrote this to hit this target. And therefore, if I shoot it at the target, it's going to nail it, right? That doesn't always happen. So I can do everything correct to make this book to hit that target, and it can still not hit the target. And I think what we don't understand about writing is that it's so much more complicated than just me reading a book and deciding that I'm going to write something that's similar And then naturally, it's of course going to sell because there's so much demand out there. And again, this isn't to say that there isn't demand. There can be demand. And also, even in a saturated market, there's always going to be unmet demand. So there could still be demand, but I could have other things that are wrong. I could have made bad packaging decisions. I could have a blurb that's not hooky enough. I could be not as great at running ads. I could have released on the same day as seven other people who all released similar books. I could have had a glitch in my, right? Like there's so many things that could potentially happen. So I had better be certain that I'm writing my best books by writing quote unquote to the target if I'm going to take the chance of shooting that arrow at the target, because that target is invisible and it's moving and it's on fire. And what that means, we want it to be like archery, right? Where we're standing and shooting an arrow at the target and it's going to hit that target because I'm standing here and we're stationary and it's visible and it's definable. Nope, it's invisible. So it does exist somewhere, but you can't see it. It's moving all the time, so it shifts a little bit when people get too bored of something and you don't know when that happens necessarily until after it's already happened. And then it's on fire, so it's consuming itself all the time, and it may pop up in different places, and it may completely disappear and vanish at some point, we just don't know. Those kinds of things are not predictable. What's probably not going to happen unless it's a super trendy thing that just goes away in a flash is that it's going to disappear and never reappear again. It's just that it's going to move around a little bit, right? So some people, when they are very good at hitting the target or when they've hit the target for the first time, they can continue hitting the target and have an easier time doing that because they have a better sense for how to produce something for the group of people that they've now attracted also. So again, the reason I cover this with so much depth is I think a lot of us just don't understand these things. And we hear the concepts discussed and we don't ask enough questions to understand what's really going on. So then when we get certain results or when we've done something that we think is supposed to meet these characteristics, or someone is telling us if you'll just write to market, you'll sell, and you don't hear from the thousands of people who have written to market who are not selling because they all think they've done something wrong, right? Like they all think, well, I clearly didn't, write enough to market or etc. And who knows, it may be that. It may be that your first page is garbage. It may be that your whole first chapter needs work. It may be that you didn't hook them enough at the ending. It may be that the first sentence was not understandable. And because this market's so saturated, people can move on quickly. There are so many reasons that this might be happening, and they might have nothing to do with the fact that you didn't write this for a target because you may not be a target writing person. There are some archetypes when it comes to writing to market, and there are certain people, and we're going to cover the skills that they have in just a second, the overlap of skills that they most commonly have that are foundational to being able to do this well. They have other skills, but you may just not be a person who's going to excel at writing to a target, but you may excel at existing in a neighborhood and writing books for the people who are in your neighborhood that are now wanting things from you, wanting to interact with you, and not interact in terms of like physically person to person interact, but wanting to purchase from you, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk a little bit. Oh, and I had to give, I was like, wait, where am I going to talk about this? Yes. So the originator of this concept, the first person I heard this from was Nat Connors at Kindle Trends. And just on a side note, the most fascinating marketing tool in terms of actually packaging and marketing tool that I've seen is if you go to kindletrends.com/infographics, he has these malleable data centered infographics about the top 200 or 400 books in all these different genres and the things that they have in common and what the patterns are and that kind of stuff. So if you're ever interested in more marketing stuff, go check those out. But the first place that I heard about this was that was kindletrends.com/infographics. Such a good resource. But the first place I heard about this was from Nat Connors at Kindle Trends, and his whole insistence about the way that we think of the market is that we need to be a little bit less hyper vigilant about what's happening in the market around us. That when you exist in your own personal neighborhood, in your home, you are not necessarily out on the street at all times trying to evaluate house prices. You aren't always worried about what color your neighbor's living room is, or whether they're home or not, or whether they're parked on the street. But we get into this extreme level of hypervigilance about quote unquote the market because we think we're supposed to write to market. So we think we have to be hypervigilant about it. And then instead of just existing in the neighborhood and only going out to ask questions or understand when we actually have need of it, instead we think that this hypervigilance is somehow going to help us because, again, we're thinking about the market as a target and not as a neighborhood. And I really think that this shift between metaphors is probably the most key thing that we can possibly do. And Nat and I are going to write a book on this at some point about market awareness. I'm writing a book on writing to market, on the skills of writing to market. That's hopefully, it's not going to be available anytime in the next couple of months, but hopefully will be available quickly because I want to illustrate the fullness of some of these skills in case there are people out there who decide, you know what, the neighborhood is cool. I want to be aware of it for like marketing and things like that, marketing decisions, packaging decisions, etc. But I also want to try to shape my books for this target. And so how do I do that? But what I'm trying to argue is that the majority of authors are going to be better served by thinking about their market as a neighborhood than they are going to be thinking about the market as a target. And so thank you to Nat for that. Kindle Trends is an amazing data service that I use as well, and we promote it a lot. We don't get any kickbacks from them because we don't do affiliates and they don't do affiliates, but I do think that it's worth looking at least at those infographics once you get a sense for what I'm arguing here about most of us with our neighborhoods and what's beneficial for us. So, and again, of course, like because every author's different. If you know me, I'm the strengths person, right? So I do a lot of personality work for authors. And of course, because every author's different and has different baseline skills, then some people excel more at writing to a target and some people don't. So when I excel more at these skills, the ones we're going to cover, then I may be super excited about writing to market because it's something that I have a lot more natural ability for. I maybe have a lot more practice at doing some of these things than other people do. And then if I don't, I need to free myself up from feeling like I'm supposed to be doing this hyper vigilant stuff that everybody's encouraging us to do. So if we are so different, and there are some very specific skills that in writing to market are visible, then how do I know what those skills are? Becca's going to tell you. We're going to talk about them now. And we're going to talk about the skills of both writing to market and market awareness. And so here's how I want you to listen to the next several minutes of this presentation. When you hear something that feels like an absolute no for you, I want you to mark it down. Like, nope, this is not something I will ever be good at. I don't like that. I don't want to do it. Then you write that down. Because depending on which of these groups you're talking about, which are the groups of skills, in the target, like the writing as a target, or the market as a target, the fewer of those skills you have, the less likely I'm going to encourage you to be considering the market when you're writing. But then we have the question of, okay, if I'm not going to create my books for the market, how do I practice awareness around selling and packaging and things like that? Maybe editing might come into play a little bit more in the awareness piece. how do I have the awareness that I need to have without turning myself into a hypervigilant mess, sitting in my house, like being so conscious of what's going on outside me if my house is in the neighborhood I'm writing in, right? So let's talk about this. So, in terms of writing to market, skill number one is understanding resonance on a conscious level. And what that means is I can see when I read Legends and Lattes, because I have this skill, I can see, oh, people will resonate with this. Oh, oh, they'll love this. Oh, they'll love this. They'll love this, etc. Like I can almost think like a reader in certain situations where I'm not necessarily thinking about my own preferences. I'm only thinking about my own preferences when I'm enjoying things. But when I'm looking at a book and I'm trying to understand it, it's easy for me to pick out who would resonate with different things and for why. And it's easy for me to understand those collections of resonance, which we're going to talk about in a second, because each of these skills sort of build upon each other, right? So, understanding resonance consciously is very important if you are going to write to market as an intention, because you have to be able to know readers are going to love this, readers are going to love this, readers are going to love this. There's a slight difference in this one where if you're writing for your platform, you may know my readers love this because they tell you, and then that would be I'm writing for my market, right? Instead of writing for like the cozy fantasy market. So this may come from multiple places, but this is definitely a skill that if you don't have this, it's going to be really hard for you to write to market because you're not going to be able to understand consciously why readers might prefer one thing over another. So, just as an example, the low stakes part of cozy fantasy is something that I hear a lot of writers complain about because a lot of writers who like faster paced books will read cozy fantasy and they'll be like, I'm bored because nothing's happening. And I'm like, right, but you don't understand the tension that is present in those scenes is what those readers want. They don't want the high levels of tension, the extra, right? Like this is a group of people who can understand nuance and tension in relationship and don't need anything else to propel the story forward. But if you don't understand that, you might be tempted to try to write quote unquote cozy fantasy that has high stakes in it. And then you've just ruined one of the primary organizers of the cozy fantasy. It doesn't mean you maybe haven't still written a great book. And that's the difference between the market as a target being the definable and understandable, right? You may still be reaching demand as it exists inside of individual readers with a higher stakes fantasy book. Spoiler alert, you're just writing regular fantasy at that point, right? But specifically cozy fantasy is low stakes. So understanding resonance on that level is one of the skills of being able to target the market. Skill number two is being able to prioritize elements based on commonality. And what that means is if you can read 45 cozy fantasy books and you can see because you happen to pick the sample set, oh, there's orcs in all of them. Well, therefore, if you don't understand that it's not a requirement for orcs to exist in order for a book to be in this genre, you may see 45 books with orcs in it and think, well, I have to have an orc in my book, and having an orc in my book makes it a cozy fantasy. But that's not what makes it a cozy fantasy, because if you understand how to prioritize the common elements based on not just their commonality with the sample size that you happen to have picked, but understanding the larger genre, right? So, this is something about understanding fantasy, where if I've read 15 cozy fantasy books and they all have orcs, but I've read 700 fantasy books and I know that not every fantasy world has an orc in it, then I can understand how to prioritize those common elements, right? Skill number three is the ability to write characters that are aligned. And I don't just mean writing characters whose actions make sense, although that is part of it, but being able to write characters that fit the story correctly. Because if it's not a genre that you love and you are not a reader of that genre already, then you may have unconscious preferences that you don't understand, where you may be writing a character who does better in a high stakes world when actually you need to write characters that would do better in low stakes world. So either their motivation has shifted, which if you read Legends and Lattes, and I'm going to spoil at least a little bit of the beginning for you, the orc who is the main character in Legends and Lattes, yes, was a warrior and yes, was a fierce warrior, like one of the best according to the books. But she's tired, right? Like she's done with all of that life. So her motivation has shifted, even though she was in this life, may have been 40 years ago, may have been the main character in like a Lord of the Rings style book with really high world ending stakes. But she's tired, y'all. So she doesn't want to do that anymore. She just wants to bake scones and make lattes. And yeah, me too, girl. Like same. That like I get that. So the shift in that character makes her a good alignment for that particular book. But if you write a character who is too high stakes, because that's the kind of character you like to write, and they're always acting in the ways that would naturally be good for them to act, but then you put them in a low stakes environment, suddenly you're doing things you don't realize you're doing. You don't have the ability to write a character who belongs in that world or belongs in that story. And it's partly because you don't know the nuance of how to create characters that are different from your own preferences. And again, this is like there are a couple of different skills that build on those, on that builds on those. Anyway, I'm sorry, reverse that. So, skill number four is having control over your characters. And those of you who do not have this, you will immediately know who you are, because no matter what you try to do, you can't make your characters do things that they don't want to do. That's just the way that it goes, right? So when you are wired like someone who needs to be able to write people who exist outside of your brain, then it's going to be difficult for you to write to market unless you like writing the books. You like reading the books. And in that case, you're not necessarily writing to market anymore. You're writing to your preference, which again can overlap with the market. But me trying to target something very specifically means I have to be able to control the characters. So I have to be able to shape their actions in a way that still feels organic. And some of you can do this no problem, but some of you can't. And then we need to just acknowledge I either have to start picking characters that are aligned with the types of stories, or creating characters that are aligned with the types of stories that I'm going to write if I'm doing the target version, right? Or I have to be willing, yeah, or yeah, you have to have control over your characters if you're going to write to market in this way as a target, right? Executing no matter your preference is the fifth skill here, and that essentially means if I would prefer high stakes, but I really want to hit this market, I have to be able to execute with excellence no matter what I would personally prefer. And it has to not come across if I don't like the thing that I'm writing. Because there are people, and if you were a romance fan, you have probably read these books before. You have read books that are so clearly by someone who is disgusted by romance novels. And the way that they write them is just so lifeless and so judgmental. They are not writing them like fans of the genre. And it's so much better if you have the capacity to execute on with excellence on organic writing in that way, even if you aren't a personal fan of the genre. If you are not a personal fan and it affects you, it's going to come across in the way that you're writing. Okay. Skill number six, to be able to shape or cut for expectations. And this has a lot to do with the way that we create stories as almost like outcroppings of, let's say, like through lines, right? So if I'm writing something that is too complicated and I have to take a character out, because I need it to be short and pacey, because I'm writing, let's say, like a thriller instead of a cozy mystery, then I may have to take some characters out. I may have to shape the narrative a little bit. And it may be that it's not something that would naturally occur to me to do. So if it's not, I'm going to have a hard time seeing where all of those different threads are in the through line. So whereas some people, if you're like knitting or something, some people you snip a thread and they can pull it all the way out and just get rid of it because it's that just that one color comes out. Let's say if you're doing like needlepoint or something, right? But if you're knitting and you pull one color out, all of a sudden you have all these open loops that now you have to go back through and sew all those loops back in. And if you're not a person who realizes that you have all these empty open loops because you don't understand the structure and function of narratives, even subconsciously, it can happen subconsciously where like you can't tell if you get 4 chapters in and you used to have a third PI and you get 4 chapters in and suddenly you have these 2 PIs can't be where that third PI was because they are in separate places and now you have a thing that has to happen for the plot, but you can't get either of the other 2 PIs to be there because you had to take the third one out. So now you've got all these open loops and you don't know how to close them because sometimes you have to be able to shape and cut for expectations. And that's just one extreme example. But the baseline skill here is being able to see where you have to have threads pulled back in, threads sewn, threads cut, right? And not everyone is capable of doing that. And then the final one is that you have to be able to write whether you are inspired or not. And so many of us struggle to write things we are not inspired by. And it is important to take this seriously. I think a lot of people are like, oh, this isn't something that you should ever worry about. And I'm like, nope, you have to take seriously the fact that some of you need to be inspired by what you're writing. And then if you're a person who, yes, easily I can do this, I don't need to be inspired, etc., then you don't have to worry about that. So the reason that I break these skills down, and obviously there are other skills that are necessary to be able to shape and craft books for the market, but these 7 foundational skills are things that when you are excellent at them, it makes you so effective at writing to market with excellence because there are parts of the writing process that if you are not organically coming upon the story or creating the story from your own brain, you have to be able to pull some of these things apart with a lot of a critical eye almost, right? And if you're not capable of doing that, you're really going to struggle to write to market. And then I would say, but there's a more effective way for you to write that isn't quote unquote shaping something for the market, right? So if we are assuming that those 7 skills are the kind of foundational baseline skills for writing to market, and the fewer of those you have, the higher the likelihood I'm going to suggest you don't try writing to market and instead try writing either organically or intuitively or whatever discovery or outlining based on, expectations or whatever it is that you are going to do, but you're not going to do this very conscious studying the market, trying to figure out what everything has in common, trying to shape a book that those types of people would want, etc. And instead write a book and then use the market as the way to sell the book that you've already written. Or potentially, because this is something Nat and I talk about in the quick cast that we are doing on the writing to markets or the market awareness skills, which is you could potentially use market guidelines as a way of shaping and editing after you've already finished writing a book. So I could use it to kind of bump up the tropes or to increase the stakes in certain places. Or I might highlight the enemies to lovers part if that happens to be selling right now, et cetera, et cetera. But that has more to do with my market awareness and me just understanding that there are some things that are more popular and then by having a very specific question or need, and this is the key with practicing market awareness, is that I want to have a very specific question that I'm asking. Like, what should my covers look like? What should my pricing look like? And you'll see this in Nat's infographics, right? He has these 5 different segments of those infographics that one by one go through the covers, the concepts, the pricing, the ranking, so that you can understand what's directly around you and how long it's been there and stuff like that. And then the categories, like the topic map and the categories. So this really is more of a marketing tool. And it's because he's making the assumption that either you're going to write to market or you're not. And then once you decide when the book is finished, you're going to have some things that you need to do to either package it or understand the market that your book is appearing in, or etc. And then all of those decisions are going to get made by, I'm sitting in my house most of the time, and I am mostly not conscious of what's going on in the market, but every once in a while I'll have a question and then I'll go looking for that answer. So I might ask a friend in the industry, I might go to the infographics, I might go to Kindle Power Search, I might go to something like, if I'm looking for keywords for ads, I might go to Publisher Rocket or something like that. But I have these very specific questions that I am leaving my house and now becoming vigilant about what's going on in the market. But most of the time, I am not being vigilant about what's happening in the market. I'm just doing my job. I'm just writing. I'm just existing, right? But so let's go over the skills of what that market awareness looks like, because some of us need to get better at these in particular. So the first skill is contextualization. I have the ability to understand what is in my market and what isn't. So if I'm writing in a genre, then my genre is my context. If I'm writing in a niche, then my niche is my context, right? And what I mean by that is I might be writing cozy fantasy as a genre. That's a fantasy genre. Cozy fantasy is a niche. Orc romance, cozy fantasy is a niche of cozy fantasy, right? So if I know I'm writing this very specific type of book, or I'm writing this bigger picture type of book, or whatever, my ability to understand the context of what's around me is a market awareness skill. The important piece here is that some of us are going to do this consciously and some of us will do this unconsciously. And some of you are unconscious contexters, unconscious vigilancers, unconscious focusers, unconscious practicers. Some of you are unconscious at most of these skills, and you think there's something wrong because aren't we supposed to be vigilant, etc. And I'm going to say a lot of these you just don't have to think about unless you have a specific question. And then that becomes where you decide, okay, I need to go look at the covers because I am getting new covers for a new series. What I don't want you to do, and this is why the second skill after context is vigilance, what I don't want you to do is always be asking the question, every time my sales dip, should I be recovering my books? Every time my sales dip, should I go look at what's hot and what's tropey and trendy? Should I change what I'm writing? Should I shift, etc.? And this is the vigilance and focus kind of go hand in hand in this way. So many of us are practicing too much vigilance because we think that we have to, because we think that every single decision requires some kind of information and contextualization. But often what happens is I need to just decide where I'm going, like a plane, decide where I'm going, put the coordinates in, and go in that direction. And then when I get there, evaluate what I have done. Because for so many of us, we just don't understand that the evaluation piece, which is the fifth skill, and we'll get to the other two in a second, but the evaluation piece needs to happen at the end of a strategy or at the end of a tactic. So many of us are trying to evaluate midstream, and we don't realize that we're going to get faulty results because we're not going to be able to actually evaluate the full practice, right? So focus to me means limiting what I'm going to look at, not being open all the time, not being subscribed to everything, not always like I have to be able to say no to some things. And again, we're doing a full episode on the quick cast about this in a couple of weeks. So there will be more information coming out about this. But vigilance, well, most of us are practicing way too much vigilance. And what we actually need is focus to help us be able to be less vigilant. And then the fourth skill of market awareness is practice, understanding that I have to consistently make decisions in a direction in order to be able to get the data that I need to see how I've done. I can't always tell if I've done something right just by the release numbers, just by the first month, just by the sales in any one particular time period. Oftentimes, I need to be able to iterate and practice to see if the results hold, because so often, and this is why evaluation is the next skill, I'm trying to evaluate based on either such a limited data set that I can't see anything, or like anything that's meaningful, or I'm trying to evaluate something that I have such narrow expectations for what success looks like. So I want to try to increase my security and patience, which are skills 6 and 7, to be able to commit to these longer term visions and then not hold myself as accountable. And so much about practicing market awareness is about understanding that this is a very long game. And most of the decisions that I'm going to make in this game, I'm not going to know for sure whether they were right in the moment. And I have to commit to doing my best to remain patient instead of vigilant in the face of changes and shifts. And then always maintaining hope, because I would say that's the eighth skill in either one of these things. So, how do you know which one you are? So, the easier the first 7 skills, the writing to market skills, were to you, just even to think about or understand, the more likely that you have the capacity to be successful in that. The harder those skills are, or the less you understood them, the more likely you need to write sort of intuitively or organically, or you need to write what you want to write or something like that. Again, there's the kind of different archetypes of writing to market, and the island archetype or the trailblazer archetype are not going to be as vigilant. They are not going to be as conscious of what's going on. So we talked a little bit about, doesn't mean your books are guaranteed to sell if you write to market. No, but the goal is always to write a great book. Like that's always number one. So we want to increase our own self-awareness, understanding where we fit, understanding how our strengths or personalities or skills lend to this, and then pick one skill to increase. Some of you need to increase your personal security. You need to be able to self-regulate better. You need to be able to answer and control your fears better, because your fears are making you feel like you have to be vigilant all the time and you don't. And then pick one to start and take action in that direction. So, is writing to market for you? You have to surround yourself with people who will help you on the path you've chosen, and then question the premise of everything else. And that's so important to me. That ability for you to find certainty that you are doing it correct is going to be hard won, but it's going to be worth it, because no matter what happens, this is a long game. There's always the capacity to recover from any mistake. So remind yourself that this is a long game and it is worth doing it for your whole lifetime. Again, author for life behind me, right? That's the goal, author for life. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope this has helped you. Please do check out betterfasteracademy.com/links if you need anything. And we can help you take the strengths test or do whatever you need to do. So, but thank you again for listening to this. I hope that it's been helpful for you. There's more information on the Quickcast, which is our free YouTube channel. You can just watch it at your convenience. And I hope this has been helpful for you. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.